The Wellbeing Show. I'm your host, Noel, and I have a wonderful guest this evening. It's funny doing a show on. I just realised what I did. I looked down because Diane's box on the screen for me is below me, so that's sort of how unconscious these habits become. Sort of in the beginning of the lockdown, none of us would have thought I'll be looking at squares on a screen, but it's automatic now, isn't it? I guess we all knew what I was doing. Anyway, I'll introduce Diane very shortly. Just to remind you, this is a live show this evening. It'd be lovely to hear from you. You can drop comments in one of the platforms we're streaming on, either Facebook Live or on the YouTube channel. James hopefully will pick them up and have a look at them and send them through to me. Or indeed, you can drop me a message on +44 7506 319 745. That's on WhatsApp, is probably best. And you can also join us if you want via that. I'll get you on air, make you a star. There you go. You can't ask more than that. Anyway, enough of that. Let me introduce Diane. I'm not even going to attempt your second name, Diane. You're going to have to tell me how to do it, because I will just make an idiot of myself. So that's all.
It's Danzebrink.
Danzebrink. There you go. Exactly as it's spelt. I probably could. Right. Where's that from?
That's German.
It is. Are you German by birth, or
no? My husband's father was German.
Okay. Well, so there you go. So you're a Brit who married into a foreigner.
Indeed.
So you haven't sounded particularly Germanic too.
No. And I'm certainly not fluent.
So it's lovely to have you on the show. For those that can't see it, maybe listen to the podcast. Diane has a sort of a thing behind her which tells her the organisation that she's from, which she set up, Make Menopause Matter. And we'll be discussing all of that and getting to know you a bit. So please do join us. It's quite a significant issue at the moment, menopause, simply because there's been some issues around medication and stuff like that, and it's sort of hit the news. There's been, I think, patchy coverage, and we can talk about that if you like. But I mean, there's been a sort of division. It's a really tedious division. The sort of middle-aged blokes who report it downplay it as an issue, and the female presenters don't, because there is that gender division which really annoys me, because actually menopause doesn't just affect one gender, although it's centered around one gender, but it affects people around them as well, which I'm sure we're going to get into. And a lot of women have male partners that go through the menopause with them, and a lot of guys are a bit lost about this stuff, to be honest. So
absolutely,
I think talking about that, the more and more we talk about this and not turning into women's issues, it's human being issues, it's family issues, it's relationship issues, it's health issues, etc., it's employment issues. So and it's all part of sort of reproductive health and physical changes, etc. So just tell me like a little bit about you, Diane. You didn't get into the health field, wasn't where you started, I guess, was it?
No. So I've done several things over the years, but it was probably over 20 years ago, I did counselling training, but then went off in a completely different area. And I actually worked for quite a long time as an equine physiotherapist. I had a real love of horses, and I went down that route for work. And then it's almost, actually, Noel, it's within a few days of 10 years since the anniversary of my surgery that put me into surgical menopause. Right. So I went into surgical menopause, and essentially the sort of fallout from that made me think again about where my interests really lie and where my passion was. And so I went back to studying. I did some training, some nurse training in menopause. I did more counselling and coaching training. And then I brought those two things together so that I could support women individually, particularly around menopause. And then eventually that led on to me setting up Menopause Support, which is a community interest company. And then further on from that, as you said, the banner behind me, which is the Make Menopause Matter campaign, which is the national campaign to improve care and support for menopause. So
Right.
yeah, you know, my experience, as with so many people who campaign and become very passionate about something, my personal experience is what's really led to that.
I remember before the show, I mean, I always have this telephone chat with all my guests, and really so they can figure out whether they want to come on or whether they want to run a mile from sort of, and rather stupidly you agreed to come on.
Here I am.
There's something wrong with you already, we think. But it's good to have you here nevertheless. But one thing you talked about, because you'd mentioned to me about the training as a counsellor, and sort of, you know, this story, but I'm going to say it anyway, that the beginning of psychotherapy very much was around these types of issues, in that Freud was investigating, and in fact had a bit of a circus around what was called hysteria and hysterectomy. Hysteria, it's all about the womb, it's all about women's issues, and there's been a long, and the term really comes from sort of Greek terms as well, in Greek times. But for those that don't know, Freud employed women to pretend to be quite off the wall in these performances of his new analytic science. And he had various working class women that he paid quite a lot of money to. This was they made a living of doing these extraordinary physical displays, which were, you know, completely bizarre and bonkers, and loads of blokes in these medical arenas looking at them, and Freud making points about their wombs and hysterectomies and this sort of stuff. And that was the beginning of this weird profession that I'm part of. And it's like it's a very unsavory whole thing, but it's not unusual to turn sort of psychological and physiological issues for women into a circus or a joke. And we've seen it recently, I think, in terms of some of the reporting that's been going on. And I think that's the link for me, is I've seen, like, breakfast television, some of the guys on there, one just really making ridiculous claims that sort of women with menopausal issues taking away resources from cancer patients. I'm like going, where is that nonsense coming from? Well, it's always been there, hasn't it? So
yeah, it absolutely has. You know, how many times have we read and heard of women being described as hysterical? How many times, you know, I can remember, I was talking to somebody about this the other day, and, you know, I can remember back in the 70s and 80s seeing on national television, you know, comedians who, you know, had menopause as part of their, you know, as part of their show. There would be sketches about menopausal women and how funny it was. And actually, if you're somebody who's experiencing significant menopause symptoms, it could not be less funny. And this term hysterical has been applied so often to women who, and it's purely because of the lack of understanding of the you know, the effects that the changes to hormones can have, and that it's not just hot flushes and period stopping.
So menopause means, the definition is you haven't had a period for a year, you're in menopause then.
So the word menopause actually means the cessation of periods.
And to be called menopausal, i.e. in the menopause, you have to have had no period for a year. Prior to that, you're in what's called perimenopause, is that correct?
So actually,
once tell us these terms and what they mean a bit more.
So it sort of falls in. We use the word menopause to cover the entire transition, but in fact, it starts with perimenopause. So peri meaning around the time of, which is a little bit confusing in itself, because around the time of can last for several years. So for most women, they will be perimenopausal by the time they're 45. For many of them, those perimenopausal
early.
symptoms,
I thought it was a bit later. That's interesting.
no, most will be perimenopausal by the time they're 45, but many will actually begin their perimenopausal symptoms in their early 40s.
Right, okay.
So perimenopause can last for several years. And as you said, menopause itself, clinically, is the definition is that you have 12 continuous months without a period. Everything after that is termed as postmenopause. So for most, they will live 30 plus years of their lives in postmenopause. It's also important to remember that you can have transgender and non-binary friends, family, and colleagues who can experience menopause symptoms. It's also important to know that 1 in 100 women under the age of 40 will experience menopause early. 1 in 1,000 under 30, and 1 in 10,000 under 20.
Wow. I mean, we're talking about a lot of people. I didn't realise that it's normal and healthy for it to start sort of in the early 40s, the perimenopause. So that's really interesting information for me. Thanks for updating my knowledge base on that one. So let's thinking about the perimenopausal phase, because that's often when the medical symptoms are diagnosed. It's like it's not. I don't really think of it as a medical sort of issue. It's a life transition. And you know, I'm getting older. That's not medical. That's just I'm getting older, right? So it isn't really turned into a pathology and given a specific name by doctors and treated. Nevertheless, there will be things that happen during that perimenopausal phase, and I want to come circling back to the fact that yours is a medical menopause because you had an operation, which is again a different experience. But I think it's useful to talk about that perimenopausal phase because it goes on for a while and certain things happen, and that transition I think is quite important. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, 100%. So essentially what's happening is, so everybody who is born with ovaries, if those ovaries are functioning, then they're born with essentially an amount of eggs in their ovaries. So clinically, they're called oocytes. And essentially, as we age, the store of eggs depletes. It gets lower and lower to a point in our lives where essentially the lowering of that store of eggs will mean that the hormone levels that you've been having fluctuate probably on a monthly basis that create a monthly period, those hormone levels start to change. And so they can become quite erratic. So your progesterone level will fall quite hard and quite fast. And then your estrogen level, rather than doing something like this on a monthly basis with your progesterone falls off.
I might be listening on the podcast and not seeing it.
Oh, okay.
So
it's a gentle rise and fall.
Yeah.
But then the estrogen during perimenopause can become quite erratic. So if for those who are watching, it looks like this, but if you're not watching, if you're listening, it can go up and down both regularly and quite erratically. And because we have estrogen receptors all over our bodies, so from the top of our head to the tip of our toes, when the estrogen levels start to fluctuate, that can potentially, not for everybody, it can potentially cause symptoms. Now, 1 in 4 women will experience no symptoms at all. 3 out of 4 will experience symptoms, and 1 in 4 will experience what they call debilitating symptoms. So having a really severe effect on their quality of life. And symptoms,
physical things, and then there's the psychological, emotional sequelae. You and I were talking about this. I don't think people really understand the importance of hormones in terms of our mental health, our psychological well-being, as well as our physiological, because hormones are our feelings and thoughts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And estrogen is highly expressed in the brain. So when estrogen starts to fluctuate, that can affect, as you said, not just physical symptoms, but also cognitive and psychological. So for the vast majority...
Let's talk about that word, highly expressed in the brain, so people really understand this. So, like, just very simply put, brain cells are not physically connected. Okay, so people that don't know this, and we think about our brain cells, but they're not physically connected. There's a little gap between each brain cell in which things called neurotransmitters operate, and those are hormones essentially. So serotonin is one of them, dopamine is another one, estrogen is another one. So these are how our brain is connected, because it's not, when it becomes physical through myelination and stuff like that, and you know about all of that process, but myelination is only a fatty acid wrapped around a set of brain cells. They're still not physically connected, they're just held in place to make it easier for these hormones to transmit down. And so these hormones are literally what runs us.
Yeah, they're helping the function, essentially. Yeah, absolutely. So when the estrogen starts to fluctuate, so we can have, you know, as you mentioned, physical symptoms. For many people, they already know about hot flushes and night sweats, but there are lots of others. There's about 34 symptoms of menopause generally, but they can be things like heart palpitations, joint aches and pains. Periods can become heavier, lighter, more frequent, less frequent. And then things that people have probably never connected with their changing hormone levels, things like dry eyes, dry mouth, changes to gut and bowel function, itchy skin. The symptoms that nobody ever wants to talk about as far as the physical symptoms are concerned are what doctors call genitourinary symptoms. So they're things like increased urinary frequency and urgency, vulval and vaginal symptoms. Then you've got the cognitive symptoms. So under the umbrella, usually of brain fog, but they're really changes to memory and concentration. And then for the vast majority, and certainly, you know, we have a support community of around 30,000. And I would say that without a doubt, the first symptoms that most people experience, but they don't recognize because nobody's ever told them about them, are the anxiety, the low mood, the mood swings, the loss of confidence, what they call a loss of joy, those things. And of course, as you will know, Noel, you know, from everybody that you've ever seen, if we don't understand what's happening to us, what does it do? It raises our anxiety.
Without stress. Our stress levels go through the roof. And sort of, again, so that people understand, there's a concept called well-being, which I think has just been torn apart and is almost meaningless these days. But it actually is an important concept in health. When we have a sense of well-being, and this is talking to this loss of joy thing, when we have a sense of well-being, the evidence is quite clear that physically we're healthier, emotionally we're healthier, and it's a global impact. It's what's called a global effect upon us. So every aspect of our lives improves through well-being. So hence the NHS has invested so much into well-being. I mean, I get a bit annoyed because I think it's been hijacked by a lot of people, turned into sort of stupid well-being programs that are meaningless. But well-being is essential, and the loss of that is a disaster, you know. And also I think, and this is really interesting for me as well, I think that some of the symptoms that you're describing are classic symptoms of depression, withdrawal, isolation, loneliness. And I'm guessing that is a major experience of women who are going through this, as well as some sense of loss of identity.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, a lot of people will say, so some of the really common things that we hear on a daily basis are, I feel like I'm going mad because they don't understand what's happening. I feel so alone because they feel as though it's only them. I don't know who I am anymore because I don't think, as you said earlier, I really don't think that we're taught about the power of hormones.
No, not at all.
So, you know, sort of that loss of identity. I
People
also
couldn't
think
even tell you the difference between stress hormones and reward hormones. And understanding that is a fundamental in terms of well-being.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Understanding dose, dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, you know all of this, and understanding the stress hormones and how you reduce stress hormones, improve the dose, etc., are one of the secret keys of life.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So if you're feeling, you know, as we know, as human beings, we love to have a sense of control. So if you're feeling out of control, if you're feeling that you don't understand what's happening to you, if you're feeling very alone, if you can't describe what's happening to you, and if you try and describe what's happening to you, or you try and seek professional support, so that might be from a GP, and you're told, well, clearly you're anxious and depressed, but you know for a fact that you're not, but you don't get what it is because you've never heard of perimenopause. That just compounds it all. Yeah,
and it's interesting. And I wonder, because I was surprised it started so early, and I was like, I wonder how many people know about.
Because lots of people don't know. I mean, I think that's still something. You know, you said earlier about, you know, sort of menopause and how it has sort of become more of a has got more media attention, but I still think that there are millions of people who have never heard the word perimenopause and certainly don't know what it means.
I totally agree. I think that's absolutely 100%. Just coming to the issue of trans issue, just describe to me there what the sort of things that you hear from people who is experiencing the perimenopause, and what's going on there. So
for transgender, okay, so not my specialist area, I have to say, but I think what's been ignored, and you know, we know how difficult it can be for those who are seeking help and support within the trans community anyway. But what's become really obvious is the absolute lack of information for transgender men about having any kind of, you know, information about menopause. Because obviously, if you've still got your ovaries, if you haven't had surgery, if you've still got your ovaries, then you potentially, you might not be using testosterone. So if you're not using testosterone, you will at some point still experience menopause. And I mean, I have to say that I have, we've been looking, you know, we've been approached by several mothers of young transgender men who have said, you know, I realize that potentially this is, you know, this is going to be something that they're going to need to know about. I mean, I had one lovely lady who her child had full surgery as a, you know, as a young person, and had absolutely no information. You know, I talk about me having no information after my surgery, but, you know, sort of somebody who was having that surgery as part of their transition and still had no information about the fact that they had essentially gone into surgical menopause at a very young age as a transgender man.
Well, let's talk about the surgical menopause, because that's what you experienced, and the shock. The reason why I wanted to deal with perimenopause is because I think, you know, Mother Nature is amazing, and the perimenopause is a transition which allows you to adjust, sort of in terms of your identity and your psychology and your relationships. It gives you a bit of time, if you like, and so although it's uncomfortable, it does give you the opportunity as an individual to process the experience, as it were.
I would say with the right help and support, it allows you to do that. However, for some people, it's it is severely debilitating symptom wise.
Yeah.
And so that opportunity is almost not there, because they're focusing consistently on the fact that they can't get the right help and support for their symptoms.
Yeah.
So it's a very, very individual thing.
Okay.
You know, for some people, you know, the 1 in 4 who have no symptoms, you know, sort of, they're not going to be in the same situation as somebody who's having really challenging symptoms. And I think, you know, you and I spoke about this, Noel, when we were speaking on having our telephone conversation. And I think, you know, one of the shocking things that we see is that unfortunately, when we look at figures from the Samaritans, which obviously come from the ONS, you know, the suicide figures for women peak between the ages of 45 and 54.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah. Point well made. That's right. That's absolutely on point. And that's what we're talking about here. And this is the seriousness of the issue.
Yeah.
And you went through a surgical menopause. Can you just sort of say what that means? Why? You know, we don't need the details of your surgery, figure out why. But, like I said, it's not Jeremy Kyle, but
no, absolutely nobody needs that.
but what does that mean, a surgical menopause, and then what was that experience like for you?
Yes, so a surgical menopause is essentially having both of your ovaries removed at the same time. Yeah. So it's usually for either something like endometriosis, it's very severe endometriosis, or you might, in my case, it was suspected ovarian cancer. So there are reasons why people might have their ovaries removed before they, you know, sort of earlier in their lives. Okay. So for me, I was in my 40s when I had my ovaries removed. I actually had my womb and my cervix removed at the same time too. And for me, it all happened quite quickly because my diagnosis, my mother had ovarian cancer, so obviously that informed the clinicians as to, you know, how serious this might be for me. So I had 2 or 3 appointments, scans and appointments with gynecologists. It was decided that I should have a total hysterectomy, but prior to the surgery I was not given any information about all of those symptoms. I knew I would be in menopause, but for me at the time, 10 years ago, that meant maybe I'd have some hot flushes and no more periods. I had no idea about all of the rest of it. Okay. And so I had my surgery. 2 days later, I left the hospital. I left with no information about being in surgical menopause. I left with no hormone replacement therapy. And I didn't even know that I needed it. And I was told, if you think you need to, go and see your doctor in a few weeks' time. And that was that. So I'd been plunged into menopause.
Surgeons would have gone, okay, cancerous ovaries, get them out, operation successful, end of story.
Yeah.
The human being and the consequences of living with that, not even just sort of, you know, actually, sorry, I'm just going to get angry if I continue talking about it, because it's like, it's just so wrong.
Oh, it's all right, lovely. Welcome to my world every day.
There is no level on which it's right to operate in that way with, I don't mean the pun operate, I mean to behave in that way towards a human being. It's just not okay to treat them, a human being, as just simply, there's an aspect of their anatomy that's important, and you deal with that aspect of their anatomy, and that's it, you've dealt with them. That's just absolute nonsense, and sort of, for whatever it is, it's just
absolutely it's not there's no sort of holistic package of care, essentially.
There was no package of care at all.
No package of care.
Otherwise there was nothing.
Interestingly, and I know this is not just my experience, but interestingly, I never even got a follow-up appointment to go back and speak to the gynecologist. So, you know, if you break your arm, you tend to get a couple of follow-up appointments. But in having major abdominal surgery, No, I never even got an appointment to go back. So for me, because I didn't know, my focus was, okay, let's look after myself. Let's look after, how I'm caring for myself, take my time getting back into my stride, etc. I decided that I would go and see a nutritionist who essentially gave me 7 pots of different things and said, oh, well, you'll be fine. Of course, with hindsight, I know that was never going to be the case. No amount of herbs was going to replace the estrogen from my ovaries.
No, not unless you ate a sort of barn full of them on a daily basis.
It was never going to work. And unfortunately, I had heard, so I did actually go and see a doctor several weeks later. And that doctor did mention HRT to me. But at the time, I said, no, thank you. And there was no further conversation. And the reason I said no, thank you, was because I'd read all the scary stuff that everybody else has read over the past 20 years. And at the time, I was having a few hot flushes, but actually, I thought I was doing okay. It was really...
Now that you brought the issue up, let's talk about HRT and the misinformation that exists around it. And then we'll come back to when you discovered you needed HRT and what it did in terms of helping you. So what are the sort of misinformation issues around HRT?
Well, so I think the major issue has really been all the headlines that we've seen over the past 20 years or so, which essentially say, HRT gives you breast cancer. That's essentially what they've said. Now, that all came out of a huge study done in the States called the WHI, the Women's Health Initiative study. When the initial press release from that study came out, that's when those headlines started. But that study has been re-examined and re-examined many, many times by teams of researchers and clinicians over the last 20 years. And essentially, what we have come to know is that the increased risk that they were seeing in that study is what doctors call non-statistical. So the statistic is so tiny that
it's irrelevant.
It's irrelevant, basically. Unfortunately, those 20 years it's left a huge mark, because what it's done...
You're not telling me that the press got hold of it and blew it out of all proportion and have continued to do that because it sells clicks. You're not suggesting something as ridiculous. The press wouldn't do something like that, would they?
You would never see that, Noel, would you?
Good Lord, I can't imagine it.
Surely not.
Surely not.
How dare I suggest it?
Murdoch doesn't have a sort of business empire based upon selling fear. Not at all. That couldn't possibly be true.
No, what a suggestion. So essentially, as you can imagine, that when that study first came out, not only did that have a huge effect on the women who were taking HRT at the time, I mean, a lot of them just literally threw it away. It also had a massive effect on medical health professionals, on GPs in particular, because they had been happily prescribing HRT for many years to very happy women. However, it then put them in a situation where they didn't know if they were doing the right thing for their patients anymore.
And certainly in the US, they'd be worried about litigation, not so much in the UK. But and so did that mean HRT rates dropped?
Oh, hugely.
Right.
Significantly. I mean, there was a huge fall away of HRT prescribing. What's happened since, essentially, is we have, in the UK, we have the British Menopause Society. So the British Menopause Society is essentially our sort of expert clinicians. They have a medical advisory panel, and they produce information based on all the factual evidence-based information available. And then as part of the British Menopause Society, we have what's called Women's Health Concern, which is really the patient arm where that information is disseminated for the public. So if any of your viewers or listeners are thinking, where can I get good factual evidence-based information, Women's Health Concern is a great place to go.
Do they have a website? James can put that up.
They do. Yeah, absolutely. It's Women's Health Concern. Yeah.
Okay, James will sort of and so just the facts are what, HRT is safe, right?
So the facts are that for the vast majority, HRT in the right dose, in the right regime, for the right individual, the benefits significantly outweigh the risks. Having said that, there are a small number of individuals who it possibly would not be the right thing for them. But there are other options that menopause specialists and doctors can offer. But it all used to be HRT as a little tiny pill that you swallowed. Now we have what's called transdermal, which goes through the skin, which is thought to be better because it goes straight into the bloodstream, avoids the first pass through the gut and the liver. So it's all about getting the right type of HRT for the right individual in the right dose. Absolutely.
And so from this sort of link that we put out about the association, the Menopause Association, people will be able to get better information and support.
100%. And there's
so they can go armed with information to their GP and look at the options. And
absolutely.
There's scare stories about a lack of HRT medication at the moment. Can you tell me the truth and reality of that? What's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a product called estrogel. So that's a gel that you apply to the skin. A lot of people really like that product. It's very popular. Unfortunately, we're going way back into last year now. That product started to become very rare. It was very difficult to get hold of.
And that was a result of the pandemic or something like that? I don't know.
I think it was probably more to do with the amount of awareness that's being raised. You know, sort of we had the Channel 4 program that a lot of people watched and they suddenly had their light bulb moment.
So it's like that time he ran out of milk. It's just because he wanted it more. More people wanted it. It was an increased demand, essentially. But an increased demand that the pharmaceutical companies simply couldn't supply. So that then had a knock-on effect to another product, which is a spray product. That had a knock-on effect to some of the HRT patches. And so consequently, we saw shortages in many, many products. Now, that's been ongoing for many, many months. And if it's not bad enough having menopause symptoms, having to worry about whether or not you can get the treatment that's going to help you with those symptoms just makes everything worse. But what we've seen in the last 2 or 3 months is that the government have finally got on board and recognized just how important this is. They've actually created a post for somebody who is going to essentially be in charge of this in the future. But we've also seen that the pharmaceutical companies slowly are starting to catch up. And it is slow because, unfortunately, when you're manufacturing pharmaceuticals, you can't just say, oh, we want another 2 million of those. You have to go into manufacturing runs, and that might be 6 months down the line. So we are seeing things starting to go the right way, but there are still people around the country who can't get what they want. But it's a bit of a success story as well, because increased demand for these products is what we want to see, to be honest.
100%. Because
we want to see the uptake of HRT because it actually is saving lives.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. Completely, Noel. You know, this is, and I think that's a really important point to make, is that it has been very difficult, and for some people is really difficult. And I can't tell you the amount of nights that I've laid awake thinking about who hasn't got their HRT. But it is good because it shows that the awareness that we're all trying to raise is actually working, and people are understanding.
Study and dealing with the fears that women have, and sort of laying them to rest. So that's good news, and it's good news that the government are responding. Whatever else is going on, you know, having somebody responsible for procurement and putting pressure on these pharmaceutical companies from a government level, especially because our government has the NHS purchasing power.
Yes.
And so we've got big guns in terms of one of the biggest purchasers of pharmaceuticals in Europe, if not the world.
Yeah.
And so
absolutely.
We can make deals with pharmaceutical companies that make it economic for them to do this. So it's a good news. So hopefully we'll see improvements. Coming back to why HRT, can you tell me from your perspective what it was like before the HRT for you and what it was like afterwards? So I've got the idea that you had a sudden shocking transition when your body was switched off, certain elements of your body, particularly, and more about the hormonal signals. And hormone replacement therapy, people don't know, it's about replacing the hormones because they've been whipped away, right? So and we said, remember at the beginning of the program, we said hormones are the building blocks of everything we do. So if it's motivation, it's mood, it's desire, it's movement, it's thought, it's everything. So hormones are not silly. They are absolutely at the core of human experience, right?
Absolutely.
So you have all these hormones removed overnight and nobody warned you about it. And because of your lack of education, because of our lack of education, you didn't think, even when it was offered to you, why would I need HRT? I'm fine. And then you weren't fine, I imagine.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, as I say, the first 3 months or so were okay. And after about 3 months, things started to go very wrong very quickly.
Right.
So it for me, it wasn't physical health. For me, it was mental and emotional health. Yes. So I started to experience crippling anxiety.
Wow. Yeah.
My sleep completely fell apart. I was going to bed, falling asleep. I would wake up generally in a panic at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, heart racing, feeling as though there was somebody sitting on my chest. Very often would wake up and burst into tears. I spent an awful lot of time crying. I genuinely felt as though I was going mad. I had no idea what was happening to me. And
that's not uncommon for anxiety in particular. People feel like they're losing their mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
And lack of sleep as well will contribute to that because of the cognitive distortions that happen. You can have hallucinations, you can hear things that are not there, smell things that are not there, and people don't get this. It's significant intrusions in functioning. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I was becoming less and less likely to do the things that I like to do. So it got to the point where, so one of my favorite things to do every day is to walk my dogs in the morning. And I just got to the point where I didn't want to leave the house.
Yeah. So signs of depression, withdrawal.
I didn't want anything.
Cycle, because as soon as you stop doing the things, you lose motivation to do something, you decide not to do it. That increases the lack of motivation and the depression. So you were classically digging a hole there.
Absolutely. So I stopped wanting to see people, stopped wanting to have people come to the house. The only people that I would really see, apart from my husband who lived in the house with me, was my mother. It got to the point where my husband was becoming so concerned about me that he had asked my mum to come and spend time with me so that he could continue going to work.
Was he afraid of you topping yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, the way that I describe it is I got to a point where I felt completely useless, hopeless, and worthless.
Yeah.
And I felt like a complete husk of the person that I used to be. And it did come to the point eventually where I did come incredibly close to taking my life.
Sure, yes. Just want to say at this point, because we're talking about difficult issues here that some people might be experiencing themselves. If you are feeling like you're going to hurt yourself, don't, for God's sake. Never make a permanent decision based upon what are temporary feelings, is what I would say. But if you feel like you're going to hurt yourself, it's really important that you start talking to people about it. And often these signs of I'm going mad, people are afraid of talking about it because they think what's going to happen is they're going to be locked up in some ward somewhere and somebody's going to throw away the key. We don't do that anymore, I promise you. It doesn't happen. In fact, to get into a psych ward these days, you need an armed escort with you to break in. You're not getting in. They're not letting you in, unfortunately, maybe, or fortunately. So that's not going to happen. But the shame and embarrassment, the fear, the anxiety. There are groups, so that exist, and you mentioned one, the Samaritans, and James will put the name out there. There's other sort of suicide support groups, Sunflower Suicide Support. There's local groups. For goodness sake, folks, reach out and talk to people.
Absolutely. Yeah, 100% lovely. Yeah, so I told my husband very quickly what I had almost done. And without my knowledge, he contacted our GP practice.
Right. Good for him.
And he said, I need you to see her, and I need you to see her today. And they were very good. One of the doctors saw me at the end of surgery. And I sat and sobbed. And I was so fortunate though, Noel, to see her because she got it. She knew exactly what was going on, and she was the first medical health professional to explain to me what had happened as a result of having my ovaries taken out, the huge drop in estrogen, and how that could affect me, and why I was feeling the way I was feeling. And she said, I'd really like you to try HRT. And I said, I've read all the scary stuff, etc., etc. And she talked me through the latest information. And she said, I promise you, for you, it's absolutely fine. And she wanted me to start on these little patches that you stick on your skin.
Right.
And she pretty much insisted that I stick it on there and then.
Good for her. That's the way to do it, right?
Absolutely.
Right.
And within the world that I had been living in had felt very, very dark and overwhelming. And within a couple of days, I'm not going to say that it all felt better, because I don't want to give people the idea that it works overnight. But I did start to feel as though there was maybe a chink of light, and that things weren't quite so hopeless.
Yeah. And a little bit of hope goes a very, 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 very long way.
100%, absolutely.
When there's no sense of light, you can give up. But if you get that little bit in there, two of the things that really strike me about this story, which I love, one is that your husband took control. He saw the problems and he said, right, I'm not having this. I'm going to sort this out. And I would say for the partners of people who's watching their loved ones struggle, there may be times when you just have to do that. You ignore their wishes and you do the right thing. And even if they get annoyed with you, they're alive and annoyed with you, and that's far better than the awful other option. It's like, it's okay they're angry with you, don't worry, they're still alive, and that's fine. And you'll deal with it. You'll deal with whatever sense of betrayal.
The anger will pass.
It will go. And your doctor's insistence that you take treatment. Again, that's a good health professional there. Like, that's a good health professional holding their boundaries, going, no, I know what's right here. You're going to do it. And it's you will know this as well from your training in counselling, that there's been drop-off rates in terms of the efficacy of CBT, but it's not CBT that has changed. It's the fact that the therapists delivering it, or the wellbeing practitioners delivering it, are refusing to insist that the patients do the behavioural changes. That's where the efficacy drops off, because the professional isn't saying, no, you have to do this. Don't play games with me. Just do this and it'll work. Because that's what happens to people who are depressed and anxious. We don't know when we're in those states how ill we are. And we do need somebody to lead us by the nose and force us to do the right thing.
Oh, it was absolutely 100%. It was absolutely the right thing, because, as the weeks turned into months, and sort of I was under her care, things were definitely starting to go the right way. And sort of I I was seeing and feeling. And as I say, I don't want anyone to think that it's overnight success. It can take several months to get it right. And it's important to be patient, but just being able to see that, that little bit of hope. And then
so you survived, you were alive, you're still alive now.
Yeah.
And I'm really intrigued by this. I'm always intrigued by those people where difficult things happen, and rather than, either just carry on with life or go under or withdraw, you went, hang on, I need to do something about this. There's something wrong here. Where does that come from in you? What made you, because, it's not, setting up a national organisation around these issues, that's not, I don't wake up in the morning and go, I'd like loads of extra work for no money and no thanks until 10 years later. But do you know what I mean? Yeah.
So the driver essentially was, once I did start to feel better, my question was it just me? Was I just really unlucky? So I did what we all do these days. I turned to the internet and I started to research.
Okay.
And I was coming across hundreds, thousands of people online. And at the time, we're talking 10 years ago, it was more in forums than it was on Instagram, etc., saying all the things that I had said. And I remember on one particular day, it obviously just really got to me. And I remember turning to my husband and saying to him, how the hell can this be going on with 51% of the population? Right. Menopause has been going on forever. If I ever feel back to me, I'm going to make damn sure I do something to change it. Yeah. And that ultimately, I think it's, as we spoke about the other day, Noel, you can't unknow the travesty that's being meted out against half of the population.
Yeah.
And I don't think I would ever have slept well again if I hadn't have done something about it.
I get that. No, I do understand that. And although I jokingly referred to you sort of, but why you? What is it about you? Because people can have those feelings and then decide, well, I also need to pay the rent and need to go and do this, and I need to can feel that anger. But what is it about you that it's not just anger that drives you? It's never just anger that drives people to create something. What is it, do you think? I'm interested. I ask this of everybody. I remember there's somebody I know who I feel very close to. Her name's Elizabeth, and she had one of her twin sons committed suicide after a relapse in his using. And she set up this extraordinary organisation called Drug Fam from it, which helps families that lose somebody through suicide, but also just overdoses, etc. Not just, it's a terrible way to say it. But her specialism is looking at this whole idea of people killing themselves because of their addiction issues. And she was inspired to set this up, to write about it. She set up a play and all this sort of stuff, and she's very interested. And I'm just very interested in why does somebody transform negative experience into positive and move on? What is it about you? Is it something the way you were brought up? Is it, have you always been an entrepreneur? Are you a serial entrepreneur? Is that you?
I mean, I've run a small business in the past, but very small. But I think the thing that the driver for me was, I just didn't want anybody else to get to the point that I got to.
Okay. So that's not anger, that's love.
Yeah.
That's what it sounds like.
I think the frustration was the feeling of not wanting anyone else to ever get where I got to the point I got to, that was the driver. Yeah. I think the frustration and the anger was sort of the fuel.
Okay.
Drove me on.
Coming back to how can this be happening almost hidden to 51% of the population? Well, I think it's pretty straightforward why it happens to 51% of the population. It's because that 51% of the population are women. And there's a whole framework of things that deny and hide and minimize and divert away from very serious issues that women, because they're women.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we
and so
see
it's part of that. It's part of what we would call misogyny. It's part of what we would call sexism, etc. It's part of what we have a sort of male, white, heterosexual, angry old blokes run the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and they have interests that are not this because they don't have worries about estrogen levels. That's the bottom line here, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That absolutely is it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we need to say that, because I think there is a political and social and sociological reality here that something is happening and something needs to change. Because, as you say, it's the majority of the population. And I want to say as well, we have brought up the issue of trans issues, and they are really important. And it's important we gave them the voice on this show, and we continue to raise those issues. And I don't want to get into debates about what makes a woman or not. It's irrelevant to this conversation. What we're talking about is menopause. Menopause is the loss of the ability to produce estrogen. And if you've had a lifelong dependence on estrogen, that loss of it is going to be significant, as would be the loss of any core hormone. Try and taking dopamine out of somebody's life and see what happens to them. Well, we know what happens. It's called cognitive decline. That's one of the big issues in dementia, is the loss of dopamine. Anybody seen the film Awakenings? L-Dopa, dopamine, etc. You know this as a nurse, right? So it's really important stuff that's going on. So you went from there to what point did you set up your organisation?
So it's set up originally on my kitchen table in 2015. Right. It was just me. It was called Menopause Support. And then in 2019, it became a community interest company. So now we're still tiny. Now there are 3 of us, and I also have 4 absolutely fabulous moderators who look after the community of 30,000 women.
I'm just going, oh God, where'd you get the energy to do that? Seriously. No, I'm not going to go there. I can't even.
Long days and not a lot of sleep.
I can't even begin how much work involved, to be honest. But it's also, it is extraordinary, and it is absolutely inspiring, that from that position where you wanted to kill yourself to now. And that's got to be a good thing to say and get out there, that is what is possible, with the appropriate support, this transformation. Yeah. And not just of your own life, but of 30,000 women's lives. It's like, what a story, and it came from your husband and your doctor just going, no, you're gonna get help. And thank God they did, because look what you've done with their help. It's amazing, Diane.
Thank you very much. I think it's really important that we do talk about that transformation and that opportunity in postmenopause to look at how you want to live the rest of your life, and that we start to challenge this really negative narrative, which I totally understand, because there has been a systemic lack of help and support. But I do think it's really important we talk about sort of the post-menopause and how amazing those years can potentially be.
Yeah, because something significant happens, as well as a loss, and a loss is always a birth, as you know, psychologically. So those transitions are really, really important. They're moving into something, and the new fecundity, the new creativity that is post-menopause. Because I think although the capacity to bear children is very important, it's a very important thing. I love my son. I'm going to cry if I think about him in this context. That is the best gift that's ever happened to me, will ever happen to me. But that's not the only story for women with ovaries and wombs.
No.
And the story doesn't end when the ovaries say, well, I've had enough things. There's a new life awaiting.
Absolutely. Not every woman will choose to have children. Not every woman, in fact, even, so not every woman will be able to. Yeah. For some of them, that there will be grief over that. For some of them, they will never have planned to have children. But I think what we need to remember is that because you are in postmenopause, there is such an opportunity to look to the future and look at, sort of perhaps even a good chance. I think it's a great opportunity to reflect on everything you've learned, everything you've achieved, and then perhaps think about those new purpose and passions that you might have to look forward to in the future.
And that brings us to, we're just right at the end, but I want to make sure we highlight Make Menopause Matter. So tell me this campaign, where it came from, what it's trying to achieve, and where it's at the moment.
Okay, so Make Menopause Matter is the national menopause campaign. I launched it in Westminster in 2018 on World Menopause Day, and it has 3 aims. The first is to have mandatory menopause education for all our GPs, because unfortunately, even though they're the first port of call for the vast majority, that many of them have never had any training in menopause, which does a huge disservice to them and also to their patients.
Yeah, I want to put my head in my hands at the moment. It's just extraordinary.
Secondly, is to have better menopause guidance and support in every workplace, because far too many women leave the workplace during their perimenopause. And the third was to have menopause included in the new RSE curriculum in schools, so that every young person will grow up understanding what menopause is, when it happens, how they can potentially support themselves if it's going to happen to them, but importantly, how they can support others. Because if it's not going to happen to you directly, you are definitely going to know somebody at some point in your life who's experiencing menopause.
I mean, my first experience of menopause is as a teenager with a local couple that I knew, who happened to be a lesbian couple, and we're slightly older, and one of them went through an early menopause, and I got to know about it, so it's normalised. I want to say it was much more normalised in the past. I don't know if that's true or not, but certainly there's a long way to go. But certainly people like yourself are sort of leading the way. We are at the end of the hour. In fact, we've gone over it, but that's okay. Sort of at the moment, how can people get involved and support and get support? Your website details will be up, but what's the best way in terms of if somebody wants to be part of Make Menopause Matter, for example, how can they get
so it's all really via the website. So menopause, it's menopausesupport.co.uk, and there you can find all our free resources, which we really hope that people will use and share. That's why we produce them. You can find out about getting support for yourself, you can find out about getting support for somebody else, about the community group that we have, about the education for organisations that we do, but also, importantly, you can find out about how to support the Make Menopause Matter campaign. We have around 180,000 signatures on the petition. We've already achieved having menopause added to the curriculum in England. So we're very focused on those other 2 aims right now.
Give me the child, I'll give you the adult. Absolutely. Look, you stay there. We're going to say goodbye now. Brilliant to have you on. Wonderful show this evening, folks. A really, really truly inspiring story, from the depths of despair to sort of kicking ministers up the arse. Great. It's got it all.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's brilliant to have you on. You stay there and say goodbye to folks. I shall catch up with everybody. I think I'm here next week. I think the week after I'm away seeing my boy. I can't quite remember, but we'll put on a rerun of something, Batman or something like that. Who knows? But it's been wonderful to have you all with us this evening. And do tune in next Wednesday at 9 p.m. Where we'll have another amazing guest for you, who I don't know who it is, but we will have one, whoever that is. So bye-bye for now, folks, and see you all next week.